are for the season finale of You're All Doomed, the podcast that is burning its way through the atmosphere of Jason X 13 minutes at a time. I'm spacewalking Greg.
Some people call me a space cowboy.
Rip, rip. This final segment begins with everyone scampering through the corridors and ends on the MPAA's ratings summary. Tiamat has arrived and attaches a lifeline umbilicus to the remains of the Grendel, but the Grendel's hatch doors won't budge. They try to fix it manually, but Brodsky declares that he has to go EVA, which is extravehicular activity, to jury-rig it from the other side. He'd better hurry, though, because the hull continues to deteriorate.
As Brodsky makes his way outside, Jason is bashing his way through every door in his way. Sunaran remembers that Rowan is some kind of Jason Voorhees expert, so they decide to come up with a diversion to slow Jason down until Brodsky's able to finish his job outside. While Rowan and Brodsky are working together to reroute the wires, Sunaran has plugged Cam's head into the computer terminal.
As Uber Jason enters the adjacent room, he finds himself in a familiar setting, complete with a familiar musical score. He's home. He's at Camp Crystal Lake. I can't really tell if Jason is confused or angry or just relieved to be here. He's definitely trying to convey some sort of emotion, but it's hard to discern exactly what emotion that is.
Well, they did say earlier that he had a very small brain, and they weren't sure how he was able to even operate with a brain that small. So if he's a big dum-dum, then it's not too far of a stretch to assume that he is confused and maybe convinced that he's back at Camp Crystal Lake. But yeah, he's definitely disoriented one way or the other.
And while I was dissatisfied with Harry Manfredini's musical treatment of the reveal of Uber Jason, I do really like what he did with the score for this moment. It sounds exactly like it would have back in 1980 or any of the earlier sequels. So it was a nice little familiar refrain.
We, the viewer, knows that the setting of Camp Crystal Lake is actually a virtual reality simulation, but Jason is still trying to figure this out. But apparently something in the simulation is breaking that's allowing Jason to see through to the other side of the room and see Sunaran at the computer terminal operating the controls. And so Jason starts to slowly make his way towards Sunaran.
They need to enhance the distraction. So improvising, Sunaran keys up some additional enhancements to the surroundings. Jason then finds himself confronted by two nubile teenage girls who immediately strip off their tops and talk about having premarital sex and smoking marijuana. It's a funny throwback to the tropes of this series and the genre entirely, but it just feels like they have to beat us over the head with it a little too hard.
A little bit, but I do like it because it's the most primitive thing that they could come up with to distract Jason on the fly. And somehow they knew that, co-ed naked campers were Jason's weakness. So they just plugged that into the system and showed it. So it's a little base level, but I do like the idea of like the depths that they would go to just kind of like hold Jason off for just a few seconds longer.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea. It's a hilarious idea. The concept is great. It's just there's something about the execution that I feel is a little too on the nose, and I think that that's because of the self-referential dialogue that they felt compelled to include, whether that was the original screenwriter or a revision that he wasn't involved with. It felt like they had to put a little too much emphasis on it. We get the joke. We don't need our hands held.
We cut away for a brief moment to discover that despite Brodsky's efforts, the door is still not opening. And so they go back to work to try to fix it. And it's only worth mentioning that cutaway shot because when we come back to the VR campsite, Jason is now repeatedly swinging one of the counselors who's still in the sleeping bag against the other counselor, also still in the sleeping bag, and just repeatedly just pounding them over and over again, which was a pretty amusing scene.
It was. I thought it was really funny. I counted 6 times that he bashed one against the other, although you get the sense that he'd been doing it already when the scene cuts back in, so who knows how many impacts there were. But he finishes it off with one more hit of the sleeping bag against the tree, recreating the epic kill from Part 7. One of the virtual reality campers was played by a woman named Kay Penaflor, who is a very athletic yoga instructor and has her own school and a pretty elaborate website outlining her program. It states that she does accept suggestions for speaking engagements, but that it's subject to her approval. So I'm guessing that if we send her a request to join us on this podcast, she would turn it down because Jason X is not mentioned anywhere on the site. The other virtual reality camper was played by Tania Morrow, who doesn't have really much of an online footprint at all, and I couldn't find anything else about her. The hatch finally opens, allowing everyone to hightail it to safety. They reach the Tiamat, but Rowan realizes that Sunaran has left KM's head back in the control bay, so she runs back to retrieve it. Explosions continue to rock the remains of the Grendel as Rowan narrowly makes it to safety. But just as Jason reaches the umbilicus, Brodsky reappears and slams the emergency close button behind Jason, allowing the Tiamat to launch. As the Tiamat departs, Brodsky and Jason lunge toward each other for mortal combat, and the Grendel detonates.
At this point, if I had to guess, I would say the Tiamat is at least a quarter mile away as the Grendel explodes into a million pieces, which we see from Sunaran and Rowan's vantage point looking through the window of the Tiamat. With a stunned look on his face, Sunaran says, "He's coming this way." Rowan then says what we're all thinking, "You gotta be kidding me." We look back out the window, and Jason Voorhees, only child of Pamela Voorhees, and was not a strong swimmer, is flying through outer space toward the Tiamat with his arms stretched out. But as he's mere feet away from smashing through the very window that Sunaran and Rowan are looking out of, Brodsky comes flying out of fucking nowhere from Jason's left and knocking him off, of course. But before we go any further, we just absolutely must discuss this scene for a couple of reasons. You and I saw this in the theater, along with, the 7 other people in the world that saw it in the theater. And I will tell my version of this scene that led to it being one of the hardest moments I've ever laughed in my entire life. And I'll tell you why, and then you can share your thoughts, Greg. But there's not a lot of time to process what's going on. So we see, right before Jason and Brodsky clash on the Grendel, the ship explodes. And then we immediately cut to Sunaran, and he has, a couple of seconds to react to the explosion before he says he's coming this way. And then we cut back to the shot of the Grendel exploding. And if you look very, very faintly in the middle of the screen, there's this little tiny Jason that's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I did not pick up on that as soon as I did on this viewing. I think watching it on the TV, expecting it, I was looking for it. But in the theater, when the ship exploded, in my head, because of the vantage point that we were getting, seeing the ship explode from a distance, the first thing that popped in my head was, oh, wouldn't it be hilarious if Jason comes flying through space toward the ship? Not really thinking that this was what was actually going to happen. So I had enough time to construct this thought in my head. And then right as I finished it, I see Jason flying towards us, which causes me to burst into uncontrollable laughter. But then half a second later, Brodsky comes out of nowhere and knocks him out, and just the one of the worst effects you've ever seen in your life, which just made this already ridiculously dumb scene even dumber. And I was on the floor of the theater, curled up in the fetal position, laughing so hard with just tears streaming down my face. And I looked over at you, and you were in the exact same position, tears rolling down your face. And I think, at least from my perspective, what made me laugh even harder after seeing you laugh was that we weren't laughing at the scene that just unfolded. We were laughing at the fact that we both knew that we predicted that this was going to happen a second before it did, and then it did, and then we're like, oh my God, can you imagine this? We're actually going through this. And to this day, it is the hardest moment I have ever laughed in my entire life.
I couldn't agree more. I have laughed nearly as hard many times, but I have never surpassed the level of laughter that I had in that moment. And there were a few contributing factors. One is, yes, the momentary mental prediction that's, oh my God, are we seriously going to see Jason flying towards us? And then that's indeed what happened. But the jankiness of the effect, I mean, Jason is very poorly composited into this shot, and it's absolutely comical, even if that's not what they intended. But more so, I mean, it was opening night. We'll get into why we were there. There's some history with this movie that we'll discuss in our bonus episode, but it was the end of a long day. We were there with two friends of ours who were not into this movie at all. They were sort of being good sports and came along with us, but they were checked out pretty quickly. And I found myself, my opinion of this movie has changed over time, and we'll get into that later. But in that moment, I was sort of checked out myself. It wasn't grabbing me, and I was a little bit tuned out. But then that moment happened, and I mean, it sealed itself in my brain as a moment I can perfectly recreate in my memory for the rest of my life. I mean, the fact that you and I both had the same reaction is kind of what sold it for me. And I don't remember anything else of the movie or of that viewing of the movie because I was laughing so hard at that moment. I mean, I even remember very clearly staggering out of the auditorium and down that inclined hallway at the movie theater that we saw it in, still clutching my sides, gasping for air because I was laughing so hard. And I mean, just when I thought I was going to get a handle on breathing, we cut to a shot of Brodsky tandem skydiving with Jason through the atmosphere as they begin to catch fire from the friction. And it looks like Jason is having the time of his life. It is hilarious. So, I mean, it was a 1-2 punch of, the silliest, most ridiculous idea executed in a way that I hope was intended to be tongue-in-cheek, but just goddamn comedy gold. And for that reason, it sealed Jason X, in my pantheon of movies as just one of my favorite movie memories of all time.
And I've seen it many times since then, and I still laugh when that scene comes on. Not nearly as hard, obviously, but I think, like you had mentioned, I wasn't totally thrilled with the movie up until that point, and so it was almost like this weird, like, cathartic relief where it's like, we got this really stupid moment that isn't as funny as we made it out to be, but it was just like
right.
all this like disappointment that had built up throughout this movie, and then this thing happened. And I think just because the fact that we had clearly both predicted it happening a second earlier, and not because we wanted to see it, it was like, oh, can you imagine if this movie was so stupid that Jason came flying out of the explosion toward the other ship? And then when it happened, it was just like, we've gone there. It really happened. And I died. I mean, the next day I remember muscles in my body hurt that I didn't even knew that I had because I was just laughing so hard. And the two friends that are with us are just staring at us like, dudes, it wasn't that funny. And we're like, no, it really was.
It really was.
Like, you had to be there. You weren't clearly watching the same movie that Greg and I were.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we didn't know it at the time because this was nearly 20 years ago. But I feel like in that moment, the first seeds of this podcast were birthed. I don't think we would be here doing this if we didn't have that shared moment.
Yeah, it really encapsulates like what has happened with this franchise when you think of all the things that we've seen leading up to this, and it's like, this is what we've come to. You have no choice but to laugh and be like, this is where we are. Like, we're watching a Friday the 13th movie and Jason is flying through space. And you're right, that shot of him entering the atmosphere of Earth 2, it's like they're on this like tandem skydive and he's like, wee. And it's so stupid. I mean, Jason, I love that I was watching it on the Blu-ray this time because I didn't realize how soon Jason popped up in the frame before we actually see him. Like, he's this like tiny speck of debris, and then he just gets bigger and bigger. But what makes the effects so dumb is that he's basically like a color forms cutout. Like, he's not moving. He's just like frozen in this one position as he's flying. And so like it's just someone in a computer program that's just like gradually changing the scale and perspective of this like still image. And he just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's like it doesn't really look like he's flying towards us. He's just getting bigger.
Yeah, it's sort of like when Poochie returns to his home planet and you see the animation cell just lift off the screen.
That's exactly what it is. And then when Brodsky comes in, it's the same thing. He comes flying in from Jason's left and he's not moving. And I mean, I wasn't able to process it at that particular moment, but now that I've had some time, like, where the fuck did Brodsky come from? Because they were clashing head on when the ship exploded. So why wouldn't the explosion have propelled them in the same direction at least? But I mean, Brodsky apparently is wearing some sort of like, jet suit or something. So like, that's fine. But how was he able to propel himself so far off the trajectory of the explosion and come back around and get Jason from the side? So it's just like, it's just one absurd thing on top of the other, but it will never be topped as, the hardest I've laughed in my life.
Yeah, it's a masterpiece. Unfortunately, it's not a masterpiece in the way that the filmmakers ever could have intended. It's impossible to know for sure what Brodsky's fate is. I mean, they are plummeting through the atmosphere, and subject to the heat of reentry that would normally atomize a human being. But he is somewhat shielded by Uber Jason's form, so unlikely that he survives. But we are never told one way or the other. In any case, Sergeant Brodsky was played by Peter Mensah. He's shown up in The Incredible Hulk, 300 and its sequel, Avatar, and Hidalgo. He's also the voice of Predaking on the Transformers Prime series. He popped up in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and will apparently play the Blind Master in the upcoming Snake Eyes movie.
Brodsky was supposed to be a playable character in the Friday the 13th game that we've talked about on this podcast before. He was going to be one of the characters that could kill Jason on the Grendel map, but the Grendel map, along with the Uber Jason skin, was canceled due to the ongoing Friday the 13th lawsuit, which is a shame because I think that would have been a fun level to play. Yeah,
that's a big bummer because it would have given a little variety to that game, which most of the maps are very similar. It's a lot of fun, but that would have been a cool map to run around in for sure.
Greg had mentioned Brodsky and Jason flying through Earth 2's atmosphere. The two burst into flames as they rocket toward the planet's surface. It really is one of the most majestic shots in cinematic history. We then cut to two romantic campers on the surface of Earth 2, seeing what they think is a shooting star in the night sky. They both make a wish, and upon realizing that it landed in a nearby lake, the two agree to go check it out. The final shot is Uber Jason's metal hockey mask sinking to the bottom of the Earth 2 lake.
It's interesting to me that even 455 years in the future, campers still wear, plaid flannel and camping shorts and, use wood to, for their campfire, and that they don't look like they're in the future at all. To cover off the actors who played some of the surviving characters, the young campers at the end here were played by Mika Ward, who was a stand-in on the film Mimic and appeared in the show Relic Hunter. Sadly, she died suddenly in 2012 at the age of 28, and her father still posts some very touching statements on a memorial page about her. The young male camper was played by David Cook, who appeared in Urban Legends Final Cut, is another alumnus of Queer as Folk, and in the Ashton Kutcher masterpiece Butterfly Effect. The rescue pilot on board the Tiamat was played by Roman Podhora, who appeared in the musical Chicago and in the Harrison Ford submarine movie K-19, The Widowmaker, as well as Final Destination 5. He steadily works and has been on a lot of TV since Jason X. Sooner On was played by Canadian comedian and actor Chuck Campbell, who was in John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, which is something I've never seen but keep meaning to, and I always forget, so hopefully this will spur my memory. He was also in Urban Legends Final Cut and a recurring character on Stargate Atlantis. KM was played by Lisa Ryder, who showed up early on in Forever Night, which is a series about a vampire police officer created by Barney Cohen, who wrote Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. She's still working steadily, most notably appearing as a series regular in the sci-fi show Andromeda with her co-star in this film, Alexa Doig. Speaking of Alexa Doig, she played Rowan. She also appeared in Stargate SG-1, the revival of V, and played Talia al Ghul in the Arrow TV series. She's currently appearing with Candace Cameron Bure on Hallmark Channel's Aurora Tea Garden Mystery, and the two seem to get along well. Lexa Doig is reportedly a big geek in her personal life.
One credit that stood out to me was, based on characters created by Victor Miller. Can you imagine what his reaction is? Like, oh, how far we've come. to just exactly what he imagined back in the day when he came up with this idea. A band called Mean Bunny had 2 songs in the movie. One of them plays during the closing credits. It's called X is the Loneliest Number. And another song they had was called Jason Jam.
I like that the person playing the keyboard over the end credits here sounds like they're just one half note out of sync with the rest of the musicians.
I also saw a credit for a fact checker named Maurice Le Explicateur.
Always keeping an eye out for people with nicknames and quotations in the credits. The assistant property manager was Jeff Darth Maul. One of the gun wranglers was John Frenchie Berger. And one of the standby carpenters was Robert Smitty Smith. I also saw that Pixar got a special thank you, which I found odd. And Dean Lorey, who was the screenwriter of Jason Goes to Hell, was also thanked. I got a kick out of the fact that the copyright date on this movie was MM, as it was completed in the year 2000, and that's the only time I would ever be able to read the Roman numerals on a motion picture copyright date. There are no confirmed deaths in this episode, although we can speculate that Brodsky and Jason were burned to a crisp re-entering the atmosphere, and it's pretty safe to say that those 2 campers who go investigate the falling star are going to be dispatched if Jason is in fact still alive.
As per usual, we'll be back next week with a bonus episode to get into any discussion points that we weren't able to in the previous episodes. But until then, we need to end this episode so we can go visit some VR camping girls. So tune in next week to hear all about it on another episode of You're All
Dude.